I never saw it coming. One morning, I walked into the office like any other day, the familiar hum of computers and clatter of keyboards filling the open workspace. My coffee steamed in my hand, my mind cycling through emails, project deadlines, and the looming 300-millimeter merger everyone was buzzing about. It was supposed to be a regular day, the kind you barely notice until it's over. By noon, everything changed. An email appeared in my inbox. A curt message from HR, unsigned and impersonal. Your employment has been terminated effective immediately. Please return all company property. No warning, no conversation, no explanation. Just erased, like I had never existed in the company at all. I froze. The screen blurred as disbelief hit me first. My desk, my files, my years of hard work, gone in an instant. People walked past, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. My career, the very foundation I had spent years building, had been pulled out from under me without even a handshake or a goodbye. I sat down heavily, staring at the empty chair across from me. Memories of late nights, relentless audits, and endless negotiations flashed in my mind. Every painstaking effort I had made to protect this company, to ensure this $300 deal succeeded, had been ignored. And now, the company had tossed me aside as if loyalty, expertise, and diligence were meaningless. Then came the anger. At first, it was raw, hot, and immediate. The kind that makes your hands shake and your chest tighten. How dare they? How could someone so reckless, so arrogant fire me without notice? Without cause? I replayed every interaction, every board meeting, every time I had warned them about risks they chose to ignore. They had smiled, dismissed me, patted my shoulder, and continued blindly. Now, they had crossed a line. But as the initial fury settled, a new, colder thought began to form. They think they've won. They think firing me ends everything, but they just lit the fuse. Because while they had the power to remove me from the building, they couldn't remove my knowledge, my insight, or the mistakes they had buried deep within their contracts. I knew their blind spots. I knew the cracks in their supposedly flawless 300-millimeter merger, and now I had all the time in the world to let those cracks grow, unnoticed. I packed my laptop, a few personal items, and left the office quietly. Outside, the city moved on. Cars honked, people laughed. The world didn't stop for my humiliation. But inside, a plan was forming, not out of spite, not recklessly, but with precision, with patience. For years, I had been underestimated. For years, they had ignored warnings and advice from someone they considered replaceable. But the reality was simple. I was not replaceable. And if they thought firing me would protect their deal, they were about to learn how fragile the foundation really was. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I walked out with a calmness that masked the storm brewing inside. Because now, I had something far more powerful than a paycheck or a title. I had leverage, knowledge, and the perfect opportunity to watch, carefully, as the empire that discarded me began to crumble from within. The fired employee had become a weapon, precise, silent, and inevitable. And their 300-miller dream, it was about to meet reality in the most spectacular way possible. Before the firing, I had been the invisible engine behind the 300-millimeter merger everyone was praising. While the CEO smiled for press photos and shook hands with investors, I was the one balancing spreadsheets, tracking deadlines, and catching risks before they turned into disasters. Every contract clause, every hidden loophole, every financial projection passed through my hands first. If anything went wrong, it would have been my fault. And I carried that weight willingly, silently, with precision. The CEO thought I was just another employee. They never realized I saw more than just the surface. I noticed their overconfidence, their blind spots, the small miscalculations that could go unnoticed until it was too late. I watched as they celebrated minor victories, oblivious to the cracks forming beneath the glittering facade of the deal. And worst of all, I saw how easily their team could crumble under pressure because no one dared to speak truth to power. Except me. When they fired me, it wasn't personal. Or maybe it was. Perhaps they resented the fact that I could foresee problems before they did. Perhaps they wanted to make a statement, to show the rest of the staff who was really in charge. Either way, they had underestimated me, and that would be their first mistake. Walking out of the office, I didn't panic. I didn't beg. I didn't waste time questioning why. I had spent years building a network of contacts, lawyers, auditors, and industry insiders who trusted my judgment. I had quiet allies, people who respected accuracy and precision more than titles. And now, after being discarded, I had a reason to use that network strategically. I began quietly reviewing every file I had touched, every memo I had drafted, every risk I had flagged and which had been ignored. I had seen their vulnerabilities, the areas where compliance had been half done, contracts overlooked, and dependencies unmonitored. It wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about exposing the truth, the fragility of a system built on arrogance and blind trust in the wrong people. I started with minor moves, nothing that would tie back to me, nothing illegal. A carefully worded email here, a subtle suggestion to a partner there, a question to a compliance officer that planted a seed of doubt. The goal wasn't chaos. The goal was inevitability. I let them continue thinking everything was fine, while the cracks I had known all along began to widen. Meanwhile, the CEO continued their daily routine, blind to the storm forming. Meetings were scheduled, handshakes made, projections presented, all on the surface, perfect and untouchable. And yet, underneath, every miscalculation I had quietly documented, every ignored warning, every procedural oversight, was inching closer to collapse. I spent nights revisiting spreadsheets, memos, emails, and contracts, recreating the scenario that could trigger a failure. It was meticulous work, a puzzle of timing, leverage, and subtle influence. My firing had given me clarity. Without the distractions of office politics, I could focus on the single goal. Let the system fail in a way that revealed their incompetence. No one suspected me. I was gone from the building, but my mind was everywhere, tracking every minor shift, every decision, every oversight. I wasn't angry anymore. I was calculated, patient, and for the first time I felt completely in control. This wasn't just a $300 deal anymore. It was a chance to demonstrate a truth they had refused to acknowledge. Knowledge, strategy, and foresight are worth far more than titles or bravado. And by the time they realized what was happening, it would be too late. Because sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't fire or fury. Sometimes it's the quiet patience of someone who knows exactly where the cracks are, and waits until the foundation begins to crumble on its own. The first signs came quietly. A partner questioned a clause I had flagged months ago. Nothing major on the surface, just a minor hiccup in an otherwise polished contract. But I knew better. That tiny flaw was the tip of a much larger iceberg. I watched from the sidelines as emails flew back and forth. Executives scrambled to clarify points, and the CEO insisted everything was under control. Meanwhile, I stayed invisible, a ghost observing the cracks widen. I reached out subtly to a trusted consultant, not to interfere directly, but to ensure the oversight would be noticed, documented, and impossible to ignore. Every delay, every confusion, every miscommunication was now part of a growing chain reaction. The office buzzed with activity, completely unaware that the first domino had already fallen. Meetings were rescheduled, presentations needed rewrites, legal teams asked for clarification. The CEO was forced to respond publicly to questions they hadn't anticipated. And all the while, I remained calm, knowing exactly how far this could go. I wasn't acting impulsively. Every move was calculated. I had mapped the vulnerabilities during my tenure, and now I was letting them unfold naturally. I didn't need to push. The cracks were deep enough that the structure would fail on its own. Then, the first major setback hit. A key investor noticed discrepancies in the financial projections. Discrepancies I had flagged months before, and that had been ignored. Panic spread through the boardroom. Calls were made. Emails were sent. The CEO tried to contain the situation, but the more they pushed, the faster it spiraled. From the outside, it looked like chaos. From my perspective, it was inevitable. Every misstep, every overlooked detail, every arrogant dismissal of my warnings was converging into a single, unstoppable outcome. By the end of the week, the first cracks of the $300 million merger had become gaping holes. Partners hesitated, internal teams faltered, and confidence, the foundation of every deal, began to crumble. The CEO still didn't realize how close the entire operation was to collapse, and I smiled quietly, knowing the most important part was still coming: the exposure of the full scale of their negligence. They had fired me thinking they were safe. They couldn't have been more wrong. The betrayal didn't start with the firing. That was just the final blow. It began months before, hidden behind polite smiles and empty compliments. I had trusted the CEO, believed in the company's mission, and worked tirelessly to make their ambitious 300mm merger a success. But behind closed doors, decisions were being made that undermined everything I stood for. They used my work, my analysis, my reports, my compliance framework, all stripped of my name and paraded as their own achievements. I remember sitting in a board meeting once, watching the CEO present my strategy as if it had come from them. No acknowledgement, no credit, just ego dressed in confidence. I should have seen the warning signs then. But the real betrayal came when I discovered why I was fired. It wasn't budget cuts or restructuring like the HR email had said. It was because I had questioned a payment trail, one that didn't add up. During the merger process, I had noticed a series of off-book transactions between the parent company and a shell subsidiary. When I brought it up quietly, I was told to let it go. Days later, I was gone. That was when everything clicked. They hadn't just fired me out of arrogance. They fired me to silence me. I had stumbled onto something they didn't want anyone to see. I replayed every moment in my mind. Every meeting where the CEO had avoided eye contact. Every time they had rushed to close discussions about funding allocation. It all made sense now. They thought firing me would erase the evidence. But I had kept backups. I had my own copies, my notes, my audit trails, and they were all untouched, sitting safely away from their reach. For days, I battled between fury and strategy. I could have gone public instantly, leaked everything, destroyed them overnight. But that would have been too easy. Too obvious. I wanted the truth to unravel on its own, for the world to see their collapse as the result of their own deceit. So I began connecting dots. The inconsistencies I'd noticed in their foreign accounts, the irregular compliance sign-offs, the fake subsidiary that had quietly collected millions in consulting fees. It was all there, buried in plain sight. They thought no one could trace it back, but I had been the one managing the digital documentation system. I knew exactly where every record lived. I realized then that my firing wasn't just betrayal. It was an opportunity. They had given me distance, plausible deniability, and time. And as they celebrated their imminent merger, unaware of the audit storm approaching, I made one quiet promise to myself. They took my career. Now, I would take their reputation. By the time they figured out what was coming, their 300 dream would already be collapsing under its own lies. I didn't want chaos. I wanted clarity. I wanted the truth to arrive like a verdict, cold, undeniable, and final. After the betrayal, I spent nights mapping every avenue that could expose them without dragging myself into illegal territory. I had been careful my whole career. I wasn't about to throw that away now. This had to be precise, professional, and impossible to dismiss as slander. First, I protected the evidence. I gathered my copies of contracts, flagged emails, and the hidden notes I'd kept when compliance turned a blind eye. Everything that proved the transfer trails, the phantom invoices, and the broken approvals went into one encrypted drive. No dramatic leaks, no sensational posts, only facts, dates, signatures, and a carefully documented chain showing who approved what and when. Next, I rebuilt credibility. I reached out to a handful of people I trusted, former colleagues, an old compliance officer, and a lawyer who owed me a favor. I didn't dramatize anything. I simply asked them to review selected documents for inconsistencies. I wanted neutral professionals to see the errors and say, out loud, that they were real. The first 2 reluctant reads became astonished confirmations. That quiet validation was all the spark I needed. Then I used the system against itself. Large mergers rely on external auditors, underwriters, and regulatory checks. If the company had hidden something, those gatekeepers would catch it, if they were given the right information in the right way. So I prepared an organized professional packet. Timelines, red-flagged transactions, annotated contracts with clear explanations, and a summary that even a busy partner could digest in 10 minutes. The goal was not to scream fraud, It was to make regulators and auditors uncomfortable because the paperwork no longer aligned. I contacted a compliance hotline at one of the major advisory firms involved in the merger. Using an anonymous channel at first, I didn't invent anything. I presented the facts and asked for an independent review. That nudged a curiosity check. A compliance reviewer poked, asked for documentation, and then quietly escalated. The firm, protecting its own reputation, couldn't ignore a credible hint that a major deal might be built on shaky accounting. Simultaneously, I worked small levers inside the industry. I fed a few carefully worded factual observations to a consultant I trusted, who advised one of the target company's board members. I framed it as, "You might want to have your team double-check these line items. I noticed potential overlap." I never claimed ownership. Just a nudge in the right place so an actual board review would happen without anyone tracing it back to me. I also made sure the audit trail couldn't be erased. I alerted an external forensic accountant, again professionally and through proper channels, asking them to take a discreet look at transaction flows. Forensics don't speculate, they follow data. When the accountant found irregular routing through a shell account and mismatched invoice dates, their report became a paper trail that regulators respect. Every step was surgical. I never forged a document, never impersonated anyone, and never asked for illegal access. I simply amplified the problems they had already created and let credible third parties do what they do best: verify facts and raise alarms when numbers don't add up. Timing mattered. I held back until multiple independent reviewers, a compliance consultant, a forensic accountant, and my lawyer, all agreed the case was strong enough to present to the merger's underwriters and the Regulatory Review Board. When those voices aligned, the dominoes would move faster than any single whistleblower could. Finally, I prepared my exit and protection. I briefed my lawyer on the exact sequence I'd orchestrated and ensured there was a documented record showing every outreach was factual and professional. If they tried to paint me as a saboteur, the evidence would show I acted as a concerned professional exposing systemic risk, a duty, not vindictiveness. The plan was simple in its elegance. Let objective, reputable institutions do the unmasking. I had provided the map. They would do the digging. I didn't need to be vindictive. I needed the truth to be undeniable, and for that truth to come from sources the company could not easily discredit. As the pieces lined up, I felt less like someone plotting revenge, and more like someone who had been given responsibility back. They had handed me the knowledge of their failure when they fired me. I returned it to the world in the only way that mattered: through audits, lawyers, and regulators who could not be bought with smiles or press releases. The last part of the plan was patience. Powerful people often assume their problems will be handled quietly. They rarely prepare for the slow, relentless logic of documented facts. I waited, and I watched as routine checks turned into formal inquiries. The system I'd once served, the network of auditors, lawyers, and regulators, began to do its job. And when the first official request for additional financial documentation arrived at their headquarters, that knock on the door was the moment I had been shaping all along. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, precise, and it carried far more weight than any outburst I could have staged. Their empire didn't fall because I wanted it to. It fell because it had been rotten from the inside, and the right people finally saw it for what it was. It started with whispers, a few cautious inquiries from the audit firm, then an unexpected board meeting request. Within days, the tone across the company shifted. Emails became short, meetings became tense, and the once invincible CEO began avoiding the media spotlight. Something had cracked, and the tremor was spreading fast. The merger's due diligence team, pressured by the sudden questions, demanded full access to the company's financials. What they found wasn't catastrophic, not at first. But small inconsistencies began to add up: duplicate vendor entries, mismatched approval chains, and unexplained transfers to the same shell entity I had quietly flagged months ago. The findings didn't scream fraud, they whispered uncertainty. And uncertainty is poison to a $300 million deal. Investors began to stall. Partners started asking for re-verification. The merger date was temporarily postponed for internal review. The CEO tried to control the narrative, holding emergency meetings, promising transparency, even blaming clerical oversight. But behind that calm voice was panic. I could hear it when I received a message from a former colleague. "You won't believe what's happening here. They're losing it." The real blow came a week later. One of the regulatory auditors, prompted by my carefully placed evidence packet, flagged a pattern of non-compliance that required formal investigation. That meant freezing the merger until every document was verified. In the corporate world, that's as good as a death sentence. Stocks dipped overnight. Investors withdrew guarantees. The board panicked. News outlets caught the scent of scandal. A headline appeared: 300 meme merger, delayed amid audit irregularities. The CEO's photograph, once a symbol of power, now appeared beside phrases like financial discrepancies and investor uncertainty. The empire they had built on arrogance and stolen credit was now collapsing, not because of a leak, but because of their own negligence laid bare. I watched it unfold from the quiet of my apartment. Every headline, every market reaction, every televised statement. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even smile. There was a strange calm in knowing that justice, once set in motion, no longer needed my hand. Within 2 weeks, the board convened an emergency session. The merger partner pulled out entirely, citing lack of confidence in internal controls. The company's valuation plummeted. Analysts speculated the CEO's resignation was imminent, and when it came, a carefully worded step down for personal reasons, I knew the cycle was complete. Their empire hadn't exploded in flames. It had eroded silently, layer by layer, until there was nothing left but exposed truth, the same truth they had tried to bury when they fired me. No one knew my part in it. To the world, it was a corporate failure. To me, it was balance restored. Not vengeance, but correction. I had given them every chance to do things right. They had chosen deceit, and the system, once blind, had finally opened its eyes. Their 300-meter dream didn't die because of me. It died because they believed they were untouchable. And I simply reminded the world that no one ever is. When the dust finally settled, there were no grand celebrations. No applause, no vindication parade, just silence. The kind of silence that follows after a storm has passed and left everything eerily still. The company's downfall became another corporate cautionary tale, summarized in articles, discussed briefly in podcasts, then replaced by the next scandal. The CEO vanished from the public eye. Their once flawless reputation reduced to a quiet footnote in financial journals. To the world, it was just another example of mismanagement and oversight. To me, it was the end of a chapter I hadn't written, but had been forced to finish. I didn't seek out anyone from that world again. I didn't call former colleagues or send a final message saying, "I told you so." That kind of victory would have cheapened the truth. What I wanted wasn't recognition. It was peace. In the weeks that followed, I moved differently, slower, lighter. I stopped checking stock tickers and news alerts. I walked away from the industry entirely, taking consulting work where ethics still meant something. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. I built my own structure this time. Small, quiet, and entirely mine. Sometimes, though, I still think about the CEO. Not with hatred anymore, but with a detached curiosity. How does it feel, I wonder, to lose everything because you underestimated the one person you thought was replaceable? To realize too late that firing me didn't remove the problem, it exposed it? Revenge has a way of reshaping you. It doesn't fill the space left by betrayal. It just clears the debris. What's left afterward is something closer to clarity. I learned that silence can be louder than outrage, that precision can be more devastating than fury, and that the best justice doesn't scream. It simply lets truth speak for itself. One afternoon, months later, I received an anonymous envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a clipping from a business magazine featuring the failed merger's post-mortem analysis. Someone had highlighted a quote from an anonymous source. It all began when they let go of the one person who understood how everything worked. I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in my drawer. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that doing what's right, even when you've been wronged, will always leave a cleaner legacy than revenge ever could. The truth had done its job. The empire had fallen, and I, The person they thought they could discard without consequence. Walked away free, not as a victim, not even as a victor, but as someone who finally understood the power of walking away once the world has seen what you already knew. In the end, they lost $300 million. I gained back my peace. And that, I realized, was the only profit that ever really mattered. Weeks later, the office stood like an echo of what it once was. Silent, stripped of arrogance, and haunted by the memory of its fall. The glass walls that once reflected pride and ambition now mirrored emptiness. Desks were cleared, nameplates removed, and the air smelled of stale coffee and defeat. It was strange walking past that building again, knowing it had once been the epicenter of my humiliation, and now of their collapse. The company had been forced to restructure under emergency management. The board fired half of the executive team, including the CEO and his loyal deputy. The merger was dead, the investors gone, and their brand value evaporated almost overnight. The same media outlets that once praised their visionary leadership were now tearing them apart in exposés filled with words like negligence, deception, and internal audit disaster. But behind the headlines, my life had quietly moved forward. I wasn't looking for revenge anymore. I was rebuilding. I joined a smaller firm, one that treated people like human beings, not numbers. My new office wasn't made of glass or polished steel, but it had warmth. There were real conversations, laughter that wasn't forced, and respect that didn't need to be earned through silence. For the first time in years, I didn't dread Mondays. Sometimes I still thought about the day I was fired, how cold the conference room felt, how my hands trembled as I packed my things. Back then, I thought my career had ended, but now I understand. That day was the start of something else. The sting of betrayal had faded, replaced by something colder, sharper, clarity. Power built on lies always eats itself from the inside. It might take months or years, but corruption has an expiration date. The CEO, I later heard, tried to start another company, but his name had become poison in corporate circles. No one wanted to be associated with him after the audit report went public. The deputy CFO faced legal scrutiny after a whistleblower came forward. Not me, but someone braver who saw what he did after I left. Funny how truth ripples. One act of courage inspires another. And soon, even the most guarded lies crumble under their own weight. One afternoon, I received an email from an old colleague. She wrote, "You were right all along. I wish I had listened sooner." I smiled reading that line, not out of pride, but peace. I didn't need an apology from them anymore. The collapse itself had spoken louder than any words could. They had destroyed themselves, one arrogant decision at a time. As I closed that chapter for good, I often find myself sitting by my office window, watching the city lights flicker like 1,000 tiny stories being written and erased. Somewhere out there, another version of me might be sitting in another cold meeting room, being told her value doesn't matter. To her, I'd say, don't break, observe, learn, and wait. The world has a way of balancing itself, even when justice moves slow. Because revenge isn't always loud. It isn't chaos or confrontation. Sometimes it's the quiet knowledge that the truth eventually surfaces. In a boardroom, in a balance sheet, or in the headlines no one saw coming. It's the satisfaction of knowing you didn't have to destroy them. They simply gave you the tools, the motive, and the silence to do it naturally. I walked away from that company without bitterness, without hatred, just a quiet certainty that what's meant to fall will fall, no matter how high it stands. And when it does, those who were dismissed, forgotten, or underestimated will be the ones left standing, watching from a distance, free at last. This is Revenge Untold, where silence speaks and justice finds its voice.